r/confessions. Sit back, relax and enjoy this video. I've recently confirmed that for the past 12 years, every time I use the word strangled, people replaced it with bully. This is a long story, it's been a long ride for me, so I apologize if it seems random. Why? First things first, I'm a nerdy guy, so I get why this happened, but it doesn't diminish the years and years of alienation I'm only now able to contextualize. Here's the backstory. When I was 12, I got accepted into one of those science high schools that you need to take a national entrance exam for, and I was able to score high enough to be accepted into the main branch of the school in the capital. This meant moving 500 kilometers from where I lived, but in exchange I'd receive a higher quality of education. I, of course, took the opportunity. I stayed in the in-school dorm, and on the weekends I'd live with my aunt. I learned later on, or rather deduced, that my father had not properly prepared for my arrival and had thrust me on my aunt with little notice. I lived with 3 other boys in that dorm room and everything was fine for 4 months. My roommate got annoyed with me for something and started strangling me. I remember watching the horrified looks of my 2 other roommates as they realized what was happening. I remember nearly passing out. I remember having to drag myself to my bed to hide. And I remember the thought passing through my head that I was going to die. It took a lot of effort, but I found the courage to tell someone what happened a few weeks later. I talked to my aunt about it and I will never forget the words she told me right before she left for work. "Are you sure it wasn't your fault?" One day later she had her help dump me back in the dorm with my roommates. I didn't take to that well, as you might imagine. I became paranoid and terrified all the time. It became difficult to focus or study. Some major exams were fast approaching, and looking back, I must have become so depressed that I couldn't even study. My aunt noticed, and when she questioned me I answered that I just wanted to not think about school at that time. She called me a liar before promptly dumping me back in the dorm with my roommates. It took another few months before I could muster up the courage to talk to my parents about it. My father was knee-deep in the sunk cost fallacy and his sister's rhetoric that he blamed the city, the help, and sometimes even me. I think that was the point that my life just started to spiral out of control. I started having nightmares every night where I was being murdered in my sleep. On good days I'd sleep for a full 4 hours, but usually I'd have 2 to 3. Things stopped feeling real after a point, and by the end of my freshman year, I started hearing voices in my head telling me to kill myself. The silver lining is that I got out. It took a year and a half, but I finally decided to just leave that room. I did this under no one else's advice but my own. I was either 13 or 14 at the time. My aunt would still drop me off with my old roommates, but I'd just moved to the bed I had claimed in another room. A year later, my aunt would kick me out for being problematic. These 2 events, me leaving my room and my aunt kicking me out, would lead to some of the calmest and most peaceful periods of my life. My nightmares abated, my sleep lengthened, and I actually started doing not terribly in school. For a time, things were looking up. Everything was still a raging dumpster fire, all things considered, but things were fine. It should be noted that my memories of this period, spanning from the incident to the entirety of college, are hazy. Between the sleep deprivation, near constant terror and paranoia, from the nightmares of being murdered in my sleep, and the normal stresses of school, I remember desperately looking for something to help me cope with everything. I remember finding something like a switch in my head, and suddenly things moved like they were on fast forward. Like I was watching myself idle my days in a trance. Even now my memories are weird. What I do remember is fragmented and anachronistic. Imagine having to deduce the circumstances of some of the most important events of your life. That's what it's been like for me. Back to the story though, college was fine until around my 3rd year, when the stress, workload, and daunting realization that I was suddenly going to be thrust into the real world, and that I was utterly unprepared for that for a ridiculous number of reasons. I had a major nervous breakdown which saw me skip out on all my finals for that semester. I had to come clean at some point, and I did during the Christmas holidays. They were rightfully concerned. My parents' solution though? Faith healing. My mother, you see, was very religious. During my high school years, She had given me a scapular and told me to pray to help me sleep. It helped, sort of, but when it became apparent that it didn't solve the problem, she consulted a local shaman and came to the conclusion that I was being haunted by an evil spirit. I remember going to said shaman a few times over the years. When the big nervous breakdown hit, she decided that she hadn't been dealing with the evil spirit aggressively enough. She sent me to a faith healer from the city over and had her perform a ritual to exorcise the evil spirit. The problem was, the faith healer made many major errors in her assessment and made some statements that reopened some old wounds, and by the end, I had become worse than when I had started. I told her this and said I needed to go to a psychiatrist instead. She insisted that I go for another round with the faith healer instead. It was at this point that I started slamming my head into a cabinet begging her to send me to an actual doctor. Eventually she relented. I've been through 4 psychiatrists at this point. I've only ever liked the first. He was, incidentally, the only male psychiatric professional I ended up going to. My sister who finished psychology said he was a hack, and for all that I liked him. I can't disagree with her. He did some pretty unprofessional stuff, and even in the throes of whatever I was going through I could tell his priority was to make a profit, but I still found him the most helpful of the doctors I went to for 3 reasons. 1. He was male. 2. He wanted me to keep coming back, and 3. He saw me at my absolutely lowest and worst. You see, he was the only psychiatrist I went to who seemed to take what happened to me seriously. I had a talk with my father a few weeks back and it confirmed a suspicion I had had regarding the whole affair. He believes I was bullied. He doesn't believe that I was strangled. He believes to this day that I was exaggerating for attention. I was terrified I was going to die and he thought I was lying. There were actual people who witnessed the entire thing. People whom I'd named. People whom my aunt had met. And when I take that single tidbit into account, everything makes sense. I've talked to 10 people about this and in all but one of them, they made things worse. They'd tell me to deal with it, that I'm just overreacting, that I should just let it go. Let this thing that consumed more than a third of my life, this thing that I had to deal with since I was 12, this thing that destroyed my ability to trust anyone or anything go. Family, teachers, literal counselors and psychologists, all people claiming to want to help me and all people who made things worse in the process. I never fully understood their reasons or actions, but if I take this one realization into account, everything makes sense. Every time I told them what happened, they thought I was exaggerating. Every time I told them my roommate strangled me in high school, they replaced strangled with bullied. Every time I felt like they were belittling my experience, they were. I was traumatized when I was 12 and everyone just assumed I was, as my aunt put it, a spoiled, lazy millennial. I understand how and why those last 12 years happened the way it did. What do I do now? How I killed my wife. It's been 4 years since my wife died and I feel it's about time to post this. I should put a little background on my wife's mental health. She suffered from bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder as well as depression. She was on several meds 4 years ago. My wife of 11 years and I were buying our first house. She begged the owner and I for a year until we finally came to an agreement and bought the house. On 12/22 we signed the papers and started moving in, doing the typical happy silly photos of us in the new house. 2 weeks before this she had attempted suicide by overdosing on her antidepressant meds. All it did was make her very sleepy. I know her doctor was supposed to have her committed for 2 weeks but he didn't. We had 3 little girls, 4 yo, 2 yo, and 6 mo. Everything seemed like it was going great except we couldn't get any of her family that was able to help. The more she asked the more upset I could see her get, and none of my family had a truck or lived within 100 miles so they were out. A few days later Christmas had just passed. Everything seemed great except noon would help us move and now DirecTV didn't show up to connect us. I called DirecTV and was talking to the lady. She said it would be another week and we started getting into a long conversation while she tried to see if she could make it sooner. My daughters came up in the conversation and I started bragging about how beautiful they are. My wife was on the other side of the room. I don't remember what she was doing but she was listening. I told the lady that my kids were so beautiful that if my wife ever left me or died I could go to the store with them and get phone numbers on the spot. I wasn't trying to insinuate that I wanted away from my wife in any way. This is the end of part 1, because the editor isn't. Oh, you survived. Now sub. Please.